That's the lead article of a Newsweek book review, October the 15th, 1979. This book is written by Frances Fitzgerald, published by Atlantic Little Brown. I haven't read it. I just have the review, and I did want to share it with you for a long time, and I just thought I'd bring it in on this tape today because America Revised, that's the name of the book, is about the problem with teaching history in the schools. She says that textbooks are put out by the school boards, special interests, state legislatures, and that they don't give you the real story of what's going on in the world, that they only give you a broad overview that protects a lot of specific interests, and generalities are the cover story, that they don't tell you about things like the CIA, the military-industrial complex, multinational corporations. They don't give you names or specific people, and they stay away from individuals that make history. She says that actors and conflicts disappear and are replaced by abstractions, and the texts are uncertain as to what really makes history. And she even goes on to say that the information isn't necessarily what anyone considers the truth of things that goes into the textbooks of young people. When you talk about individuals or personalities making history, I have said over and over again that history is made and decided by bullets and blackmails. And this week, 2 persons are up for blackmail and could topple a lot of heads, or a lot of activity that's going on behind the scenes, and very subtly they're making threats now to talk. The first one is financier Michael Sindona. I've made many tapes on him, the links of the Vatican to organized crime, to the Giancana family, Sam Giancana family, the wheeling and dealing of American politicians with Vatican money and corporations, bank swindles, and that ball of wax. You can get that on those past tapes that I've done. New York Magazine has an article out this last issue on Sindona, and he's been indicted now. He's been convicted of 65 fraud charges at the Franklin National Bank in New York, and he's threatening to talk, and he's threatening to name people high up in government that he's passed money to as a bagman. At the time of Watergate, he offered $1 billion to Maurice Stans from the Vatican, which is a mingling of Vatican mob money, to re-elect Richard Nixon, and according to Maurice Stans, he turned down the money, but there's no way of knowing that, because as soon as the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel, Maurice Stans and employees of the committee to re-elect the president went in and destroyed and burned and shredded all the records of people that had given money to the campaign. And I'm sure that if the Vatican had given $1 million, that would have been the first piece of paper to be destroyed when the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. So what they said they did in terms of accepting or rejecting will only be known if Michael Sindona squeals. He doesn't seem to want to go to jail. He's a lawyer, multimillionaire at one time, worth maybe 30 or 40 million at one time, linked up with Montini, Secretary of the Vatican in Milan, helped set up the Milan Mafia, worked with organized crime, and took money from the Vatican. At one point, they lost $90 million, which I felt could go into weapons and gun running and rightist organizations that is only lost on paper. And maybe Michael Sindona doesn't want to take the rap, so he's threatening now to mention American politicians that he has funded for these various groups. Another man that's squealing is an ex-spy of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's an important person. His name is Donald Deneselya. You may or may not have seen it in your newspapers. He worked for the CIA for years. He's threatening to name 7,500 CIA agents, some who are hostages in Iran, unless drug charges are dropped against a friend of his, a cousin of the former Prime Minister of Iran. Mr. Bakhtiar was the Prime Minister under the Shah of Iran, and it's his first cousin who was arrested in Virginia selling heroin to federal agents. According to this man that worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, let my buddy off, or I'm going to name which CIA people are in the embassy right now. This man worked for the Savak. He's been described by a CIA official as a man who can kill innocent people. He got names when he was on the duty of CIA, people in Europe, Asia, and so forth, and he's threatening now, if you don't let Mr. Bakhtiar off the rap for the heroin arrest, I'm going to begin naming the CIA people overseas, and particularly in the embassy. And that's important because the embassy has some pretty big ones. I felt this all along, and that's why I felt we had a stalemate, because we don't have the full list, and they must know a lot in Iran that keeps Jimmy Carter from moving and keeps the stalemate going. February 22nd, 1980, I did a tape, that was just a few weeks ago, on the increase of heroin into the United States since the Shah was out. I've done maybe 5 or 10 tapes on the fact that one of the purposes of removing the Shah was to escalate the traffic of heroin from Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan to Germany and into New York, and the flow of the narcotics is up about 300% since the Shah was out. And I mentioned on that tape that there was an arrest at a restaurant in Chevy Chase, Washington, D.C., a owner, Mohammed Roshan, and also 2 people that work for him. One is Michael Bakhtiar, that's the person that this CIA agent wants off, and another one is Reza Mienges of Springfield. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I'll spell it for you on the printed sheet. Now these men, 3 of them were arrested in Washington, D.C., and a member of the Central Intelligence Agency came to release the gentlemen arrested and come to their aid. And of course I've said the CIA has been a large purpose transporter and means of traffic of narcotics for many years, that the CIA works with organized crime and is part of the traffic, of course, from Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War and coming in from the Middle East at this time. This particular arrest involved 7 pounds of uncut heroin, which is the equivalent of $32 million at the time. $5 million was already put down and delivered to a bank when the arrests were made. It involved, as I say, Michael Bakhtiar, the cousin of the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister of Iran, and he and his 2 friends were relieved by the Central Intelligence Agency coming to their aid, and now a former agent of the CIA is saying, don't take them or touch them, or I will name CIA agents in Europe, Asia, and in the embassy. So these are 2 hot potatoes that I wanted to mention because they may get lost in the news and you may not have seen those articles. The Shah of Iran has made his last journey to Egypt, and he will be left there to die. He will stay there until he dies. I've said before that he was under house arrest through all of his travels from Tehran, where he left in January of 1979. He went to Egypt, and then he went to Morocco and the Bahamas and Mexico and New York and Lackland Air Force Base in Panama, and now he's back at Egypt, and Mr. Sadat will keep him there. He was flown on a special plane that belonged to the Central Intelligence Agency. They couldn't use an ordinary plane. I say he's under house arrest. He can't call any plane. They will not divulge who called the plane or when it was ordered for him. The middleman is protected in this particular operation. All we know is that a man named Ward Eason, who's the president of Evergreen International Airlines, said that the middleman in the arrangements was not to be identified. They won't say who initiated the request, and except the fact that this was a CIA airline. Headquarters used to be in Oregon, Newberg, Oregon. There were 19 of a large fleet used for special duty. This plane was dispatched from Detroit, another narcotics headquarters of the world, and sent down to Panama at DC-8, landed in Panama, and took the Shah to Iran. But this pilot, working with the CIA for a long time, and being a CIA Airlines, will be surely sworn to secrecy and will not talk about what the Shah said or what transpired on that airplane. Just suffice it that he has been under literal house arrest. You see, if he withdrew any of his money from the Morgan Guarantee Trust or the Chase Manhattan, those banks would go on a tailspin. He's not going to pull any money out. He's going to stay very quietly and die, and that will be the end of the Shah. And what happens to the Pahlavi Foundation after that will yet be seen in the future. The former Prime Minister of Iran at the time, just when the Shah left, was this Bakhtiar, whose cousin was the big heroin dealer in Washington, D.C. I mentioned at the time of the ab scam story breaking that Jeff Gerth was writing on it for New York Times. He's the expert on Richard Nixon and William Rogers, who's on the board of directors of the Pahlavi Foundation, and the crime figures in the Bahamas. An article came out in 1972 in Sundance magazine, Nixon and the Mafia, and if it's not too expensive to copy, I might get some figures on what it would cost for you to get copies of this, because this issue is out of print. It talks about the men around Richard Nixon, John Connally, William Rogers, Will Wilson, and others with their links to organized crime. And it goes into the law offices that William Rogers had before he was on the Pahlavi Foundation as an attorney, and I mentioned his links last week to the Shah of Iran. Rogers was Assistant Attorney General and then Attorney General, and worked in a law firm that represented gambling casinos and organized crime, and worked closely with the Shah of Iran. There was a whole connection of the Central Intelligence Agency, Richard Nixon, the Pahlavi Foundation, the Shah, the Bahamas, and the crime syndicate, the narcotics, and so forth. Any narcotics or activity of this kind that went through Iran had to go through the members, the family members of the Shah. There's no other way. The Pahlavi Foundation, the millions or billions, some of it could come not from exploiting the people in Iran, but accumulated wealth that was taken from their pocketing the drug market that they were able to control, and the people didn't get the use of that money any more than the organized crime or the narcotics market that's used here in the United States. That money doesn't go back to the use of the people. It's put in other institutions or organizations and businesses for crime members. Last week I ran out of time on the tape, and I'm absolutely fascinated with the possibilities in the murder of Dr. Herman Tarnover. And the reason I want to spend time on the tape on this, I should be going back more to Abscam. This single murder is obscured by so many little pieces of information that could possibly be put together that I just want to thread with you and go through some of my ideas on the way this murder came down, or why it did. Because the murder of Dr. Tarnover happened again when the investigations of New Jersey, Philadelphia, and New York to narcotics traffic and organized crime are just being accumulated by the FBI. And also the members of organized crime that are being investigated are linked to the assassination of John Kennedy. We'll leave out the links to Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, but Sam Giancana, Jack Ruby, John Rosselli, Carlo Prio Sequeiros, the anti-Castro Cubans, the whole ball of wax was very much part of the Kennedy assassination and the Philadelphia connections to the assassination and the Soviet Union connections, and they all have a part of this murder of Dr. Tarnover that has been fascinating me for the last week. So I just wanted to run down a few facts with you so you could save future articles on this and certain names that you may read or hear about later. Dr. Herman Tarnover, known for the Scarsdale diet, died March the 10th, 1980 in Westchester County. Gene Harris was the head of a very fancy school in McLean, Virginia, where many children of the Central Intelligence Agency and diplomats and public officials go. A very fine private school right under the nose of the CIA. She went to his house, and she said that she wanted to die. He wanted to live, and she wanted to die. So she didn't mean to kill him. She thought he would kill her. And her death wish, which she talks about, but she's very much alive, reminds me of the story that I've referred to many, many times, The Control of Candy Jones. And if you don't have that book, get it. You can write to research to Tom Davis. I'll give you the address again, and get the book, The Control of Candy Jones, a woman from the Central Intelligence Agency, a model, who was given a double personality and traveled to South Korea or Taiwan and was tortured and used an alias, another name, and led a double life. And this Gene Harris seems to have had a double life following her all along, and very interesting woman, where things that she did overtly didn't seem to match what she was doing with her occupation at the time. He had recently, Dr. Tarnover had recently left her $220,000 in his will. He updated the will, He also left quite a bit to his help, too, which seemed a disproportionate amount under the circumstances, unless they were all part of a team. And, of course, that hasn't come out yet, and we don't know about that. He was described in the Associated Press as being fond of safaris, art objects, and fascinating dinner conversation, where, this is a quote, he brought together accomplished friends of divergent views for lively discussions of issues of the day. Now, if that isn't a vague statement of newscasting, I don't know what is. Divergent views, he took one view, and they, I guess, took another. We don't know if he's extremely right-wing, anti-communist, or whether he was somewhat on the left and his friends were anti-communist, or what the issues of the day were, whether they were political assassinations or crime, or we don't know what they were, but there's some implication of political differences here, never saying who the friends were, what the divergent views were, the issues of the day. It reminds me of Freddie Prinze, the actor, who seemed like a happy-go-lucky TV star who was very much interested in a controversial subject on the Kennedy assassination, which was a divergent view from his producers and the people around him. He played the Abraham Zapruder film over and over on the way Kennedy was killed. He was going to Miami to find out who killed John Kennedy, and he was conveniently given a gun by his psychiatrist, Dr. Kroger, who worked on some famous California cases such as the Chowchilla kidnapping and other matters, and he was handed a gun at a time when he could be hypnotized and he was in a trance, and he killed himself. Now, Candy Jones was told to kill herself, and she was going to the Bahamas and jump into a shallow bit of reef there and be dead, and this woman, Mrs. Harris, left notes at her house at the school and also posted a letter thinking she would die. Candy Jones is alive and Jean Harris is alive, but they were both told that they would die or thought they would. And, of course, the divergent views and the thing that Dr. Tarnover did, we have no idea where he traveled or what he did. She was headmistress at schools in Ohio, in Michigan, and Connecticut, and according to one article, she took the same vacations as Tarnover, and they had the same stockbroker. We don't know where she went with him at all. I do know she went to the Soviet Union in 1958, and I'll go into that later. She met Tarnover right after that, but we don't know what countries they went to, whether they were bagged people for the Central Intelligence Agency, organized crime, but I have a lot of suspicions on this case. Ms. Harris was brought up in Shaker Heights in Ohio. She graduated from Smith College with honors, a student of history and economics, and a woman in Washington, D.C., Enid Hyde, mentioned in the New York Times that she remembered her well as being well-ordered and in control of her life. I don't know if she's related to Ruth Hyde Payne, the woman who helped Marina Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald for the Central Intelligence Agency. Ruth Hyde Payne has in-laws living in Washington, D.C. by the name of Hyde, but that was her maiden name, Hyde, and she has relatives there living in that area and in Philadelphia where Jean Harris lived, and I don't know if there was a relationship between those Hydes and Jean Harris in Philadelphia. She married James Harris from Grosse Pointe, Michigan, lived near Detroit, and of course in the book, The Mafia Wars and other books on organized crime, Detroit is the capital of drug and narcotic centers in the United States and organized crime. She taught history and economics at a day school. In 1958, she went to the Soviet Union. She was married and she had 2 sons, but she went alone to the Soviet Union in 1958. In 1959 is when Lee Harvey Oswald defected in October 1959. But every person in the embassy, American embassy in the Soviet Union that Oswald met was from the Central Intelligence Agency, a Mr. Snyder, Mr. McVicker, Priscilla Johnson. And 1 year after Ms. Harris goes to the Soviet Union, going from Philadelphia area to the Soviet Union, a year later Lee Harvey Oswald arrives in the Soviet Union, and then he is to go to the Dallas-Fort Worth area and be with people from the Philadelphia area, George DeMohrenschildt and Ruth Payne, who came from Philadelphia, where Jean Harris lived. Her trip to the Soviet Union and her double personality and her secrecy make me wonder who she was and what she was doing. She was described in one news account as being a very secretive. She never confided in anybody. Her husband divorced her and claimed cruelty. After he divorced her, he died in 1977, the year that she was hired at Madera School in McLean, Virginia. The school that she worked at before, the Thomas School, had folded, so they said they couldn't get recommendations from her because the school folded. And her husband was dead that year, and they allegedly didn't know about Dr. Tarnover. That was a secret life that she had, which all seems hardly unlikely for a school in McLean, Virginia, that has such wealthy private children in this kind of a private school, that they would check out the head mistress, who has access to their home address, the ages of the children, the siblings, the family, and so forth. The Washington Post describes her secret life, and that they weren't aware of what she was doing, even though the book that Dr. Tarnover had has her name in the book and gives her credit for helping him with the diet book, which she actually didn't do. They claim they didn't know about her. They've been friends for 14 years, and they concealed this relationship from people that she worked with. As I say, the people that hired her didn't seem to know about the book. And in Washington, nobody ever heard her speak of Dr. Tarnover, very few of her acquaintances. According to the Washington Post, she kept a strict separation between her professional accomplishments and her private misery. That's an interesting word because, again, Candy Jones has her professional accomplishments in New York City in the agency that she worked in, modeling and so forth, but her private misery was her intelligence work, where she was set for double operations, double name, hypnotized, and even told to kill herself, just as this Miss Harris said she was supposed to die. At work, she's described with her black skirt or white blouse, keeping appointments, being very functional in an administrative job. On the other hand, she is visiting and traveling and going off with Dr. Tarnover. Some interesting help at the house of Henry van der Vrecken, I don't know, from Amsterdam, I don't know. They were given a large amount of money, $64,000. Jean Harris was willed $220,000. A associate nurse who took trips with Dr. Tarnover when Jean Harris was working at the school got another $190,000 or $200,000. She got, and her children got another $190,000, which seems like a tremendous amount of pay for the people that work for Dr. Tarnover. The attorney representing Jean Harris is the former county judge from Westchester County, Judge Arnew, the one who ran to the post office to get the letter that she wrote and to the home to get the letters before the prosecutors could get there. They call them the Scarsdale letters because she posted letters believing she would be dead, just as Candy Jones believed that she would be dead when she went to the Bahamas. But again, both women were left alive and didn't die. Now, this woman moved to Philadelphia. She lived at Chestnut Hill in Philadelphia. When the Amscam story was breaking, the FBI chief that used to live in Philadelphia described Pennsylvania as a cesspool of crime, injustices, and corruption. And I've used that quotation many times. I'll use it over and over again. And he moved to New York to begin to investigate this cesspool of what was going on. The Philadelphia connections in the assassination of John Kennedy are many. Arlene Specter, the district attorney from Philadelphia, was a member of the Warren Commission who made up that Bullet 399 story, that famous Bullet 399. Senator Richard Schweiker was supposed to investigate the second opening of the Kennedy assassinations from Philadelphia. George DeMohrenschildt married into the Sharples family. He worked in the OSS and the CIA and set up counterintelligence as a Nazi spy, and with the White Russian group, his connections came out of Philadelphia. Grace Kelly went from Philadelphia to marry Prince Rainier of Monaco, and then Samuel Cummings, the gun merchant of the world, moved to Monaco. He worked with the CIA, went from Philadelphia and the CIA to Monaco to set up headquarters, and then London. He's the largest gun merchant, gun salesman in the world, and I'll do a little more about him later. And it was in Philadelphia that this headmistress or school teacher, history student from Smith, who had been to the Soviet Union, met Dr. Herman Tarnover. She left the Philadelphia school to move closer to him in Connecticut at a Thomas school. And then when the school folded, at that school she used the name J. Struven, her maiden name. She wasn't under the name of Harris. at that school, and then when this school folded, she went on to work for a Allied Maintenance Corporation company in New York City. She had frequent outbursts. According to Washington Post, she had the type of behavior, and I might have mentioned last week, that Candy Jones had, where she would scream out, and there was a scene in a drugstore where there seemed to be a personality change, and she wanted a drug that Tarnover had prescribed for her, and the druggist wouldn't fill it, and she was calling and was acting in a loud, embarrassing way, to the point where the school headmistress had to have the police come to calm her down in this drugstore, talking loud, and had to be calmed. And it reminded me of the outburst that Candy had when she lost her personality of Candy Jones and became Arlene Grant. It was uncontrollable, and then we get back to be Candy Jones again. When she left that one school, she went to work 1955 to 1977 for Allied Maintenance. And that's when I began to get suspicious about this Harris woman, because not only was the Abscam story breaking, but she went from a janitorial service to being headmistress of a very fine school in McLean, Virginia, and it seemed like a strange jump. And also I had read the name Allied Maintenance recently in an article, and I looked through my files. It was linked in some way to organized crime. It's a janitorial service at Madison Square Garden and takes care of other large buildings in New York. She was getting $32,000 a year. And if any of you eager beavers look up the stories, I may find it by the time I hear from you, on who bought Madison Square Garden and the Combine, because many people from drug connections and organized crime are linked to maintenance corporations, and the CIA intelligence are linked to clinging services. So here is a history teacher from Smith who had been to the Soviet Union, making travels, a secret double life, described by her friends as an actress, working for a janitorial service in Madison Square Garden, and then leaves there and takes a $10,000 decline in salary to go to McLean, Virginia, to work at this private school in McLean, Virginia. It was a strange transition, and considering all the places she had been, I was interested in it, and I also have been interested recently in the clinging services and the relationship of them to the intelligence community. Our local congressman, Leon Panetta, is trying to fight the fact that the Reverend Moon organization has a clinging security service, and they clean government office buildings. They have access to FBI offices, military facilities, and space satellite stations at Edwards Air Force Base, the home of the Space Shuttle project. And just last week, Leon Panetta was fighting the fact that the Unification Church has contracts to clean the FBI buildings, Air Force bases, and the federal government. They have an organization called International Exchange. It's based in Oakland. They've been cleaning government installations for 5 years, and they're going into Fort Ord, and they work with carpet companies and cleaning services. They're in Monterey County and in Stockton, and they use government warehouses and naval installations. And Leon Panetta has been asking how they have the right to get to these places when they're linked to Reverend Moon, and the church has been linked to the Central Intelligence Agency. Panetta rightly is saying that it is a tool, the Moon Church is a tool of the Korean CIA, and what are they doing? Cleaning up these office buildings where they have access to all of this information, the keys and the ability to go in and clean these offices. The maintenance cleaning services are linked to the intelligence community, the CIA, and organized crime. On the other side of this tape, we'll talk about another cleaning service and maintenance corporations, because it caught my eye when I read that Ms. Harris went from the Allied Maintenance to this private school in McLean, Virginia. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 435, and it's side 2 of April the 4th, 1980. January the 11th, 1980, that's tape number 423. I mentioned a man named Mr. Esposito, who's involved with organized crime, with presidential candidates, with presidents, with the Carlo Gambino family. He has links to an international corporation group in Miami and Los Angeles based. He works with Mr. Richard Hanna. who handled Korean CIA money for Tungsten Park. He was sentenced for 2.5 years for his influence buying in Congress. Mr. Park was giving him money. Mr. Esposito had links to the Moonies and the Korean CIA, the same group that are cleaning the government buildings, and he ran a corporation, or runs one, called Broadway Maintenance Corporation. And this, again, was a cleaning organization that's tied up to offices in New York City, and also out at the racetrack, cleaning out the racetracks. But the important thing is that the Esposito crime links to drugs, narcotics, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, the whole ball of wax, the Korean CIA and the maintenance companies, is not far removed from gun running and Philadelphia connections that I may have to chart out for you in the next few weeks if it gets too complicated. But the cleaning and security services, in this case it was called Broadway Maintenance. Mrs. Harris worked for Allied Cleaning, and the Moonies have their own cleaning services. But the Korean CIA, the cleaning services, and organized crime have a lot in common. There's a large operation that has not yet been put on the carpet, and again it's linked to the Moonies and congressmen involved with the Korean CIA and those payoffs. And it's also linked to international drug running and assassination teams and hit squads. James LaRosa, the attorney for Mr. Esposito, the head of Broadway Maintenance Corporation, or he used to have that, is the attorney for Frank Turple, and I want to do a little more about Frank Turple in a few minutes, and the Philadelphia connections to Frank Turple, and the gun-running connections and the assassination teams. But, as I say, I was very suspicious of this Mrs. Harris with the Allied Maintenance and the school. And as the news stories break, keep an eye open for them, because I think there's much more to the Tarnover story than just a love affair. Now they're trying to give her a defense that she was in love with him for many years, and he loved another woman that worked for him, an assistant nurse, and that he drove her crazy because of the love affair. Actually, she had a secret, separate life and other activities that they didn't know about. She kept him a secret, and they traveled, and where they traveled was a secret, and there's much more that went on at that house, I'm sure, than has been told yet, besides it just being an affair between two women. January the 4th and the 11th, and I'm looking at the sheets here, the 18th, the January the 25th, in the month of January and February, I did tapes on these men that were arrested in New York City at the Hilton Hotel. There hasn't been a word in the news about them recently. They were involved with the Central Intelligence Agency, with electronic firm in New Jersey, with Exxon, with Scotland Yard, Mobil Oil. One is George Gregory Corcola, and the other is Frank Turple. They are involved with international gun running, assassination teams, arms dealers, and they are really a large overview of the network that does political assassinations all over the world and supplies the weapons for the rightist governments and for keeping the real hardcore Nazi, I call them the Nazi, the extreme right wing, in power all over the world. You have to go back to these tapes of January and read what I have about Corcola and the corporations they worked for, the Liberian corporations and their offices in Virginia and in Washington, D.C., New Jersey, and the assassination teams. February the 1st, I did a tape on Frank Turple and George Corcola, and an article in the New York Times on Samuel Cummings, a CIA man, allegedly left the CIA in 1953, but I made note that McCord and James McCord and E. Howard Hunt at the time of Watergate were supposed to have left the CIA in 1971 and were working for it at the time they were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. This Cummings, Samuel Cummings, is from the main line in Philadelphia, went to George Washington University, and then moved to England and put up a literal fortress in Manchester, England, with $22.5 million worth of guns and 40 million rounds of ammunition for the gun, and supplies the anti-Castro Cubans, the people that worked on the Kennedy assassination, such as Frank Sturgis, Sturgis grew up in Philadelphia also. That's another Philadelphia connection. And I mentioned in February that he moved to Monte Carlo and set up his headquarters where Aristotle Onassis and Hjalmar Schacht, the head of the Nazi bank, and the top Nazis began to rebuild the German and the Japanese fleets after World War II, and has links to Argentina and to Chile and to the Operation Condor assassination teams. This Samuel Cummings is a big power who came right out of the Philadelphia main line, the same area where Mrs. Jean Harris was living before she went on to the Soviet Union, and has actually had this very active secret life that people didn't know about while she was the headmistress. The student of history from Smith College who traveled around with Dr. Tarnover, but people where she worked didn't know about him and didn't know her other life. And I mentioned in February that there is a large article about Samuel Cummings in the New York Times with a photograph of him, the private world of an international arms dealer, and he's the man that supplies the assassination teams and the right-wing governments for all the weapons they need to stay in power. He was born in mainline Philadelphia, and the article in the New York Times gives him a long biography. I won't repeat it on this tape. You can get that tape of February the 1st if you don't have it. What I'm trying to do for you on these tapes is to put together the bits and pieces of political assassinations, not only the John Kennedy assassination, but the many, many murders that take place throughout the world. And many of the actors that are not described in the history books that should be in the textbooks, the behind-the-scenes people are surfacing in ways and connecting that put a lot of the unknown little pieces of the puzzle together. I have a book. It was published in 1934. It's a book I bought recently on Zaharoff, the High Priest of War. And this Sir Basil Zaharoff was the man who funded governments and ammunition, both sides, who made a fortune off of war. And he moved to Monte Carlo and under the nose of Prince Rainier in Monte Carlo, and took over Monte Carlo literally for his gun running and gun dealing. And then this Samuel Cummings went from Philadelphia to Monte Carlo as the American connection to Zaharoff, and Zaharoff worked with the White Russians, the Tsarists, that had left Russia when the Soviets took over so that they could rearm to make war against the Soviet Union and reclaim their territory. A little blurb on the book about Sir Basil Zaharoff says, "Who is Sir Basil Zaharoff, and what difference does his existence make to American men and women? The answer is startling. Wherever there is a war in Europe, Americans suffer, directly or indirectly, from it, and Zaharoff had played a part in producing the wars of Europe for the last 57 years. This book was written in 1934. The man himself, as a personality, is almost unknown. As a force, he was equally mysterious. Not until recently has his power to stem the tide of pacifism and foment wars in order to create demands for his guns and ammunition been realized. War for profit has been the keynote of Zaharoff's life, and this book reveals the futility of any battle for disarmament as the simple citizen has tried to wage it." And there's a picture of Basil Zaharoff, Knight, Grand Cross of the British Empire, Knight, Grand Cross of the Bath, recipient of the Grand Cross, the Legion of Honor, the Doctor of Civil Law from Oxford University. Now, I got another book having to do with Zaharoff and also with Mr. Cummings from Philadelphia. The book is called Inside Monte Carlo by Stanley Jackson. This was put out by Stein and Day in 1976. And it tells about Zaharoff moving to Monte Carlo, taking over Monte Carlo, meeting his friends and other ammunition makers. And while people were preoccupied with scenes at a peace conference, he was fomenting the bloody Greco-Turkish war, and it goes into all the weapon. This book, besides the biography of Zaharoff, goes into the manipulations of Zaharoff with weapons with his base over in Monte Carlo. When he moved to Monte Carlo and made that his headquarters, he took over the casino administration and the croupiers and used that as a home base for fomenting further wars for his own profits. Then the book Inside Monte Carlo goes in to another person who moved there again from the Philadelphia group that this Harris came from, Gene Harris, Sam Cummings, and this is the man written up in the New York Times as the supplier of weapons to the two men who were arrested in New York in December. Samuel Cummings, a Philadelphian, like the princess, and I bring this up because this book is referring to Princess Grace, who came from Philadelphia to Monte Carlo to marry Rainier. It was a very convenient connection that people thought was a storybook romance of a pretty Grace Kelly from Hollywood marrying the handsome bachelor prince of Monaco. She was Grace Kelly from the main line in Philadelphia, the home ground of Sam Cummings, and it says Sam Cummings, a Philadelphian like the princess, was among the first of the new arrivals when Grace Kelly married Prince Rainier, a former U.S. Army sergeant. He served with the CIA in Korea, where he first sensed the long-term potential in captured weapons. One of his early coups was the purchase of 600,000 Lee Enfield rifles from the British government. A fresh-faced and bear-like young man with a bushy crop of hair, his Ivy League clothes and charm concealed a razor-sharp brain. By his early 30s, he was a multimillionaire and founded the International Armaments Corporation, Inter-AMCO, with agents in 70 countries and clients like Batista, Chiang Kai-shek, Sukarno of Indonesia, the Dominican Republic's Trujillo, smaller fry like Sudan's cavalry, whom he equipped with lances. Within a few years, he was indisputably the world's biggest and independent arms dealer. Now, he took off where Zaharoff died, and the arms dealing took place at Monte Carlo. Home base for Cummings from the CIA was in England, but the international base was in Monte Carlo, taking off from Zaharoff, the arms merchant. Within a few years, he was the world's biggest independent arms dealer. He was from the CIA and could offer an attractive range of tanks, heavy or light artillery, and the latest line in just fighters. He's been living in Nice with a luxurious pied-à-terre in London, Washington, and Switzerland, where Dale's brochures decided him to establish his permanent headquarters in Monaco. So this Samuel Cummings, with all of his weapons to supply the rightist regimes to put against the people, the laborers, and the people trying to get a détente or peace, he supplies the weapons. Samuel Cummings, he's described in the book Inside Monte Carlo, and also recently in the New York Times, and as I say, his home base was Philadelphia, an interesting place in terms of the people that he works with now and the political assassinations just a few years ago. There's a magazine called Philadelphia, and several years ago there was an article by Mike Mallow, M-A-L-L-O-W-E, called Who Killed Kennedy? The Philadelphia Connection. And, of course, at the time I didn't know this Sam Cummings or anything about him. But this article goes into the anti-Castro Cuban connection in Philadelphia that was linked to the Kennedy assassination, and then that goes to the Operation Condor down to Chile, where the assassination teams are sent out. The article talks about Vincent Salandria, one of the first researchers to write on the Kennedy assassination, was from Philadelphia. Richard Sprague, who was supposed to investigate the House assassination, the investigation of the Kennedy assassination, but then was later pulled off. He was from Philadelphia, and he worked with Arlene Specter, who was on the Warren Commission, who's the district attorney in Philadelphia, who, as I say, made up the Bullet 399 story. When there was going to be, around Sprague, a huge group of Philadelphia people looking into the assassination of Kennedy, and Mr. Fonzie, Terry Lazen, Father Thomas Gannon, Mr. Al Lewis, all Philadelphia connections, Burke Chardick from Philadelphia. There were over 20 people in Philadelphia connected to the John Kennedy assassination that lived and worked in Philadelphia that were closely related to the killing of John Kennedy or further killings of witnesses later, 20 of them from Philadelphia. The most notable was George and Jean DeMohrenschildt. George came from Philadelphia. Well, he lived in Philadelphia after he came to the United States as a Nazi spy and an agent of the Galen operation. He worked in the OSS and then the CIA. He went to the Catherwood Foundation, which, according to the Philadelphia Magazine, was a friend of the Central Intelligence Agency. This magazine describes in 1947, the same month that the CIA was restructured from the old World War II OSS as the nation's chief spy apparatus, a reputable philanthropic private foundation was incorporated in Philadelphia and headquartered in the dashing young DeMohrenschildt stomping grounds next to Bryn Mawr. The Catherwood Foundation was establishing funds and so forth through religious and charitable organizations as a front for a mainline operation of the Central Intelligence Agency. And the former vice president of Fox Munitions Corporation was the chief incorporator and executive of Catherwood Foundation. Now, I think by collecting articles over the past 16 years, and with current stories breaking in the news at this time, the very important pieces are coming together. In this article from the Philadelphia magazine, it talks about the group that George DeMohrenschildt worked with. He later went down to the Dallas-Fort Worth area and became the CIA control agent of Lee and Marina Oswald up until April 1963, and then he went to Haiti just before John Kennedy was assassinated, so he'd be disassociated from the group. George DeMohrenschildt worked in Mexico as an agent of the CIA with a blank check from Chase Manhattan Bank, from Nelson Rockefeller. He worked for the CIA, the OSS, and the CIA. The article in the magazine on Philadelphia describes Cummings Catherwood, the mainline socialite and former vice president of Fox Munitions Corporation, setting up the Catherwood Foundation, which had to do with spying anti-communist groups of extremely conservative white Russians, that right-wing journalists, and so forth, and they traveled around the world on what they called cultural expeditions throughout Russia and Eastern Europe, accompanied by white Russian emigres and so forth. They set up an organization, the Paoli Organization, that was linked to the Cuban Aid Relief, that had an office in Miami, that linked to the anti-Castro Cubans and to people that were involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. The article goes into the Cuban Aid Relief and a man who lived on the Philadelphia main line named E. Wharton Schober, who was a very close friend of Nicaraguan dictator General Somoza. Now, this Catherwood Foundation in Philadelphia had people like this Mrs. Harris going over to Russia and probably taking messages to the CIA in the Soviet Union prior to Oswald's arrival there as an agent. He was to leave the Marines and go over there. This group worked with Fox Munitions Company, and I will have to review for you or do more tapes on a man named Mitchell Werbel, who supplied guns to Mr. Cummings, Samuel Cummings. He made the silencers for the assassination teams for Frank Turple and George Kercola. They trained assassination teams, these men that I did tapes on this last January, the month of January, that were arrested in New York. They worked with silencers, with trained assassins, with anti-Castro Cubans, killers all over the world that would be linked to the Kennedy assassination, and Mitchell Werbel supplied their silencers. And Mitchell Werbel worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Department, the Drug Enforcement Agencies, and in 1974 he worked for the B.R. Fox Company, the Fox Munitions Corporation. Now, one Fox Munitions Corporation here was from Philadelphia that worked with George DeMohrenschildt, the assassination team, and again, Ruth Payne, that set the job up for Lee Harvey Oswald in the book depository. That Ruth Payne, whose husband worked with military at Bell Helicopter with Nazi agent Walter Dornberger, employed by Mr. Miller, the president of our Federal Reserve, now Secretary of the Treasury. This ball of wax in Philadelphia involved Ruth Payne, Frank Sturgis, George DeMohrenschildt, Fox Munitions Company, the Cuban Aid Relief, Frank Sturgis, known as Frank Fiorina, who was brought up in Philadelphia and then went down with the anti-Castro Cubans. There was this Fox Munitions Corporation, which was part of the Robert Vesco International Narcotics Traffic Organization, and with Mitchell Werbel. I'll have to set out that can of worms of the Central Intelligence Agency, the silencers and the silencers and the assassination teams, the Fox Munitions Corporation, and so forth. But the headquarters for these people when DeMohrenschildt came over here from Europe were in Philadelphia, and then these Philadelphia people spread down to Miami, to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, worked with the anti-Castro Cubans, worked with the extreme right-wing Greek Orthodox Church that were covers for the intelligence community that set up the assassination teams. Now, the important thing is that they were doing this in 1958. They were doing it immediately after World War II when DeMohrenschildt came to this country. This Mrs. Harris was in Europe in 1958. Oswald was there in 59, both in the Soviet Union. Ruth Paine was very interested in the Soviet Union, which was used as an exchange for spies, the so-called cultural exchange at the time. And again, Mr. Cummings, Samuel Cummings, the world's largest arms merchant for the Central Intelligence Agency, moved to Monaco from Philadelphia to set up his teams of assassins and gun running, and took off the base that Zarahoff had for the years before Cummings came in. And again, Grace Kelly marrying the Prince Rainier from Monaco. The headquarters of the White Russian organization down in Monaco is where Princess Radziwill, the sister-in-law of Jackie Kennedy, her sister, married Prince Radziwill. The White Russian people displaced when the Soviet Union was thrown over wanted to conquer and take over Russia again and be put back. The monarchies had been kicked out, wanted to be put back on the thrones of Europe. And the wars that we faced, the World War III we faced, the Brzezinskis, the Kissingers, the arms merchants that keep telling us we have to fight Russia, are a continuous repetition of selling weapons to these gun merchants that have links to continuous assassinations and military coups and terrorist organizations that are hoping someday, as I say, to wage this war. There's a continuous link of these same names, these same cities, the same people, the same habits of traveling, of dealing, that make connections from the end of World War II until the present day. Their names permeate my files of research through many, many sections in different places, different names, different cities that come together. And that's why I was so interested in that Tarnover murder, because of Mrs. Harris working for a janitorial service, a graduate of Smith, working at Madison Square Garden, going down to McLean, Virginia, described as secretive, described as an actress, making many trips with Tarnover, not knowing where, discussing divergent views, not knowing what, his having this huge $500,000 home and not saying exactly how he got it or what he did to make all that money outside of the diet book recently, and the mysterious help and the leaving of large amounts of money to them. There is a story there that has yet to be told, but the Philadelphia connections are interesting, and I wonder how many of these people this Mrs. Harris knew at the time that she lived in Philadelphia. As I say, the Philadelphia connection talks about the White Russian community and the Catholic Wood Foundation that was linked to Zarahoff and the Radziwills down in Monaco, the Cuban Relief Group and the Cuban exiles and the anti-Cubans that have been involved with assassination teams that go directly to Chile, to Bormann, Mengele, and Nazis hiding in colonial Dignidad and Chile and traveling all over South and Central America. Ruth Paine from Philadelphia, Marina's hostess, the woman that Leah Marina Oswald stayed with in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Her family and in-laws were worked for AID and for the Pentagon and the CIA. And Frank Sturgis from Philadelphia going down and running the gaming tables for Batista in Cuba at the time that he was the president of Cuba, and Mr. Cummings and these people were supplying the weapons for Batista. And when Castro took over the island of Cuba, then they joined the anti-Castro Cuban group and became part of the assassination teams that got John Kennedy because he called off the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was one of the reasons they got him. Sylvia Odio, a educated woman, came from the main line in Philadelphia. She's the woman that Oswald double visited in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that set up so many controversies. And William Coleman from the Warren Commission, the attorney who represented the Rockefeller interests in Philadelphia. He was later appointed a cabinet appointment by Richard Nixon. He worked for Richard Nixon. He was Secretary of Commerce and came from the Dillsworth Law Firm in Philadelphia. another member of the Warren Commission from Philadelphia. The article that I had a long time ago makes sense now as I reread it and see the Cummings, the Grace Kelly, the international armament, the White Russian, the assassination, the anti-Castro Cuban teams centered there and spreading out all over. And it's interesting in New York City that Frank Turpel and George Carcola were arrested in December, and there hasn't been a thing in the news about them in the last February and March. There hasn't been a single word in the newspaper about these two agents and their assassination teams from the CIA. Incidentally, the B.R. Fox catalog of assassination weapons has all kinds of equipment, and Mitchell Werbel teamed up with them, and B.R. Fox was legally licensed and was doing work for the United States government from the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, B.R. Fox was part of the United States government, an appendage of the CIA, and one of their agents worked closely at one time with Jimmy Hoffa. The B.R. Fox Company shared an office with Mitchell Werbel in LaSalle Building on Connecticut Avenue. In Washington, D.C., they negotiated bizarre arms deals with Robert Vesco in Costa Rica, and later Frank Turpel and Carcola and Cummings are selling huge arms dealings to Gaddafi in Libya, again with Vesco, and at the time that Jimmy Carter's brother, Billy Carter, is a lobbyist, they're sending weapons down there at this time. Libya has also said that when Sirhan is released from Soledad prison, he's welcome to move down there. I understand there's a large sum of money waiting for him. He's the man that allegedly murdered, took the rap for Thane Caesar when Senator Robert Kennedy was killed the eve of his primary in 1968. And Sirhan is in prison. He'll be released in a few years and will go to the arms of Gaddafi and Libya and collect his money for the time he served in Soledad prison. Is Cummings Catherwood from Philadelphia, vice president of Fox Munitions Corporation, the same person that founded the B.R. Fox Company that Mitchell Werbel worked with later? I don't know if it's the same Fox or not, but it's the same CIA, it's the same anti-Castro Cubans, and the same White Russian. Mitchell Werbel's family was part of the Tsarist organization and was probably brought to this country by the Cummings Catherwood organization in Philadelphia. He's one of the George DeMohrenschildt aristocracy of the Tsarist ruling class, who is arming people all over the world to make war against the Soviet Union and reestablish their social base in Russia someday, and supplying weapons to those countries and those people that will kill any leader or any person who stands in their way. I received a letter from one of my most wonderful researchers and subscriber to the tapes who lives in Minneapolis, and she said, I knew I'd seen the name Frank Turpel somewhere after we did those tapes on him and in the news, and she found her file was called Nazis in Africa file, and she sent me copies of articles written, this was from the Washington Post, going back in 1979, and she found the name Frank Turpel. It has to do with activity in Uganda and an American named Frank Turpel with a Paris-based company that supplied explosive surveillance equipment and weapon and taught the art of intelligence sabotage to Amin's death machine. That's an American from the Central Intelligence Agency. I won't have time to do the rest of that on this tape. I'll start with it next week. But Turpel had worked with the CIA. Of course, they took a disavowal when the article goes on to say how he trained people in sabotage, espionage, and so forth. But the CIA has sent these killers all over the world to train other nations to keep down their native populations. As Francis Fitzgerald said in the book America Revised, the history books keep out the names of these actors and these people in the conflicts, the kind I've mentioned today, that really make the study of history very interesting. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel. I'll be back with you next week. You take care and behave yourself, okay?